And we're good to go. So like Sandra said, I'm going to be talking about how we can better understand stress and burnout, both their cycles and solutions. Here's what I hope that you take away from my presentation today, that you understand the difference between stress and stressors, that we remember that stress can be healthy or unhealthy, that stress is different than burnout, that we can all gain awareness about how each of us uniquely respond to stress. We can better learn how to complete our stress response cycle. And then lastly, identifying steps you can take to recover from burnout. My presentation is divided into 3 parts, and it's inspired by the 3R approach to burnout. This approach to burnout asks us to first recognize or watch for signs of stress and burnout, then to take steps to reverse those symptoms or undo the damage by better managing our stress and completing those cycles. Then the third part that I want to focus on is how we can build our resiliency through skill building to get us out of the cycle of stress and burnout, which, as you'll see, is quite vicious. So those skills in that third part is going to be focused on how we can increase our physical and emotional health. So the first part is recognizing. It's safe to say that all of us have been this person time and again. Maybe some of us are feeling this way right now. You're trying to focus on my presentation, but you're receiving emails that have notifications that are popping up in your screen, or maybe text messages. You're thinking about what you'll do after I'm done talking. Or maybe you're hesitant to hear what I have to say because it'll make you aware of how you haven't been taking care of yourself. But what I ask of you is that for the next 20 minutes, we all pause as best we can to listen and be present so that we can learn what's going on in our minds and bodies and learn how to create better systems to support ourselves, and therefore how to support and recognize this in other people. I'm not going to list out all of the statistics about stress and burnout that makes me anxious. It probably makes you anxious. Instead, I want us to focus on learning about the stress response cycle itself. I want us to reflect on what our experiences with it has been and how we can complete the stress cycle. And all in all, this awareness and reflection will help us to prevent burnout from happening. All right, so what is a stressor? Stressors activate the stress response in our body. These stressors can take the shape of, they kind of come out in what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch, or what we think, these things that can do harm to us. And they come through us through our sensory systems, right? So there's something called external stressors. And these stressors come from work. They come from the different roles that we have and how they can overwhelm us. They come from cultural expectations and norms that have been placed on us by society. They may be COVID-related issues. They may be trouble with finances, family, a general lack of time, and also being discriminated against. And these things are stressors that we often can't control, but are still impacting our daily ability to function well. Then there's also internal stressors, which can be even more challenging to identify and kind of work with, because they may take the shape of such a familiar thought pattern that's been in us for years. And it's kind of like a knee-jerk reaction in our minds. Like, think about how we might think about our body image. We might really have a lot of self-criticism, self-critiquing thoughts that we might be dealing with, maybe memories that pop up when we're stressed, right? Even our responses that are based in our attachment style to our partners, to our friends, to our family. And stressors can even activate a trauma response as well. So whenever we think about everything that's kind of following us throughout our day, it takes this stream of external and internal stressors. And then we have something called the stress response. So what is stress? Stress is the neurological or physiological shift that occurs in our bodies when we encounter one or more of those internal or external stressors. So our stress response is how those shifts kick in to help us survive. Our brain is not wired to make us happy. It's wired to have us survive. I heard that quote last week, and it made so much sense to me, and it helped me to begin to want to form a kinder relationship with my thoughts that it has sometimes, right? So I want to repeat that. Our brain is not wired to make us happy. It's wired to have us survive. So our entire mind and body change in response to these stressors, these threats. So what is this woman doing? She's running her way. Her heart is beating faster. Her blood pressure is increasing. Her muscles are probably tense. She's extremely alert and hypervigilant to what's around her. She's really focused on the present moment in a very real way, as in she wants to figure out how to protect herself. So of course, we can't physically run away from all of our obligations and these stressors that are following us, like we could run away from a lion in the jungle thousands of years ago. So this stress now takes on a different shape as we've had to adapt to technology in modern life. All right, so this is a really helpful graphic to get at what I'm talking about. This is the stress curve. So as you'll see, performance is on the y-axis, stress is on the x-axis. So initially, as stress rises, so does performance. So stress can be healthy, right? But then over time, as stress continues and it becomes chronic, our performance goes down and wanes. So I want to make sure, again, that all of us are aware that a certain level of stress in our lives can be good and it's healthy. Our body reacting to stress, like on the picture on the previous slide, is part of our ancient method of survival. So our bodily reactions to stressors is what had us running away from lions, and also basically what kept our species alive to evolve into the humans we are today. So stress can be motivating. It keeps us alive. It keeps us on our toes. We're in that green zone, right? It's when we shift into the yellow overload zone where performance dwindles and stress levels rise. And that's what we want to pay considerable attention to. And that's the kind of stress that I'm talking about. Stress affects every system in our body. And when we are chronically stressed because of an ongoing stressor or multiple stressors, we are basically revving up our engines more and more without taking a pause and getting relief and having that engine, our mind and body, cool down. So this will cause a lot of damage to our physical and emotional mental health. That could be a whole nother presentation in itself called toxic stress, which if you've heard some of our other presentations in previous echoes, we've touched on. But with that being said, I do want to mention how much chronic and toxic stress is related to chronic diseases and that it can greatly diminish our quality of life or even decrease life expectancy. And then as we kind of flow over the stress curve, we see that red area, and that's burnout, right? Which I'll dive into extensively in my presentation a bit later. But right now, I want us to cement into our brains that stress and chronic stress, as shown on the curve, is a precursor to burnout. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So it's important that we all are aware that many of us have different reactions to stress. So I'm going to read through these because some of them can be kind of difficult to read with the font. So first, I just want you to listen, and I want you to take account of if one or more apply to you and how you handle your stress. So I'm feeling lost in my feelings, can't get out. I'm lashing out, confronting, protecting fiercely. I'm shutting down, going numb. I'm trying to earn love and acceptance. I'm acting recklessly. I'm moving fast, filling the void. I'm doing and doing. I'm running in circles. I'm taking control. I'm acting in anger. I'm withdrawing. I'm quiet. I can't be reached. I'm anxious. I'm saying things I don't mean. And, those are just 9 responses to stress. And I recognize that there could be many more. And so if you don't hear or see yours, it doesn't mean that it's not valid. I just want to note that. So what I would like to do, wherever you are, if you're driving, if you're on the phone, if you have a pen and paper next to you, I just want us to take a minute and reflect first on how you respond to stress. So if that means you writing down numbers, if it means you writing out a couple like keywords or phrases, I want you to do that, and I'll time us for a minute. So go ahead and just reflect on these different ways to respond to stress. And I think Andrea is going to put them in the chat too, if you cannot see the graphic. So go ahead. All right, and as we wrap up this first minute, I want us to shift. And for a second minute, I want us to consider how others around us, whether that's our family, our friends, our partners, our colleagues at work, how they respond to stress in similar and or different ways than you. And I'll bring us back after a minute. Go ahead. All right, thanks for reflecting on that all together. If anyone feels compelled to share about what you reflected on in the chat, feel free to do so. I won't be monitoring the chat, but it might be nice just for colleagues or others to see your ideas and your thoughts. So how can we bring this back to schools, right? Having these conversations in schools. The reason why I kind of thought of doing this activity is that one of my first weeks at GALS, at the school-based practicum that I'm at now, with our inclusion team, we had a conversation about what are physical signs or other indicators of mine that let other people know when I'm stressed or overloaded. And at first that was kind of jarring to me. You know, it's more of a personal thing of how do I respond to stress, right? But then as we talked about it more, it made a lot of sense because that information is so helpful for other people. Because sometimes depending on how you do react to stress, like that list that I went through, I might not be able, when I'm stressed, to communicate in the moment how my communication and my behaviors might affect other people. I might not be able to say, hey, I'm stressed right now. This is why I'm a little bit short, or this is why I'm withdrawn, or this is why I might be acting a bit more aggressive towards you. And so having these conversations as a team in a safe space when we're not already stressed and we can just talk about what might be anticipated, that can be really helpful and bring your team closer together. You might find commonalities on how stress can impact us, or maybe differences, right? For instance, I shared, whenever I'm stressed, my chest might get a little red. And so if you can see my chest and it's red when we're talking, then you might know that I'm a little bit heightened, or maybe it's a difficult meeting for me. And I don't even have to communicate with the rest of my colleagues because they'll know my signs and be able to support me through it. So just consider having a similar conversation with, your grade teachers, same grade teachers, or administration team or inclusion team, whatever might work for you. But I would highly recommend it. It can be really helpful. All right, so let's talk about burnout. So stress to burnout can be a vicious cycle. I want to dive into how stress can lead to burnout and the differences between the two so that you can really start to recognize what your symptoms are telling you. So first, I want to go through the symptoms of stress. So stress is characterized by overengagement. If you think about that cartoon woman in the picture a couple minutes ago, she's really overengaged with her environment, right? She's running, she's has a lot of thoughts going on, right? She's like really hyper aware and hyperactive. So her emotions might be more overreactive. It seems like she's on an urgent mission, right? Stress can also have the opposite effect where we have less energy because stress can shut us down, right? Stress often can lead to anxiety disorders. Its primary damage is physical. So when I talked about how our engine revving up time and again without a rest, that can really cause physical damage and lead to that chronic disease and premature death, right? That toxic stress I was talking about. So it can kill you prematurely, right? If it's not managed well. So as you'll see with this chart comparison, stress and burnout have a lot of symptoms that lie on opposite ends of the spectrum. So stress is usually about it being too much, where burnout is about not having enough. So with burnout, that's characterized by disengagement, right? Kind of a shutting down. Our emotions are blunted, which is a clinical term for meaning that our emotions are flat, right? And they're not coming out in the appropriate ways that they might usually come out, right? Burnout can also produce helplessness and hopelessness, a loss of motivation, ideals, and hope. So kind of like not knowing if you would want to be a teacher or a psychologist anymore because you don't feel motivated or passionate about your job. It can also lead to detachment and depression. Its primary damage is emotional. And just like with depression, sometimes it makes life seem not worth living. And so as you can see, these two kind of are mirrored opposites of each other. And as you think about kind of that slope of the stress curve, that makes sense, right? Because burnout's in that really low functioning area, whereas stress can be really heightened. So that's kind of like a visual for you if this is harder to understand. So some other physical symptoms of burnout that I want to point out is that energy depletion and exhaustion is the most important or the most telling symptom of burnout. Also fatigue, and you might have a lower immunity to illness, which can lead to long-term physiological issues. Just kind of like with depression, right? You might have changes in sleep habits or changes in eating habits. Some notable psychological symptoms, impatient, short fuse, not having an interest in things you usually find pleasurable or enjoyable, feeling trapped or helpless. And then professional symptoms are the ones I want to focus on most. That's feeling like we have a reduced capacity or efficacy to get work done, not being able to meet obligations. Maybe you're procrastinating, withdrawing from coworkers or social situations. You're feeling underappreciated. You have a decreased satisfaction. While those are work-related, all of these inevitably bleed into personal or other areas of our life, right? Even though it's primarily caused by work burnout. So some more things on burnout. It was officially classified as a medical diagnosis by the World Health Organization in 2019. And it said that burnout happens when chronic stress is not successfully managed. So thinking back to that stress curve, right? So going from orange to red, yellow, orange to red. So going from overload to crash and burn. This is hypothesized to build over time and gradually if we can't recognize what's going on. Research also shows that burnout impacts stress much more than stress impacts burnout, which that was kind of counterintuitive to me. So I want to kind of break that down for us. In other words, if you're burnt out and also experiencing symptoms of stress and you're stressed out, it can make you even more stressed because you're exhausted and you can't use proper coping skills. You're falling more behind on productivity. You're questioning if you want to continue to be a teacher or administrator or a psychologist, and you're feeling a lot of pressure on top of all of that. So in this way, the two are connected and can become a vicious cycle if not managed well and consistently. I also want to take some time to highlight other terms that are commonly associated with stress and burnout in helping professions that you might have heard of. And I've found that these can kind of get muddied or muddled with the way that they're used interchangeably. So I just want to call attention to the ways that they're different. So with vicarious trauma, that's a profound shift in worldview that occurs in helping professions when they work with clients who have experienced trauma. So even though the professional, like for instance, I'm a psychologist, right? So even though I have not experienced the traumatic event firsthand that my clients are coming in and talking about, I can still develop symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, like having images of their trauma pop into my head, dreaming about their traumatic experiences, right? So just because we might not experience it firsthand, if it comes over and over, session after session, day after day in the classroom, even where you're hearing about this, it can shift our worldviews and make us more hypervigilant and less open to new experiences, right? So it's really important that we understand where those shifts could happen based on our own trauma history and emotional history to make sure that we are not experiencing vicarious trauma. Secondary trauma is emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand trauma experiences of another. So this has to deal with hearing secondhand or having an indirect experience with the trauma of someone else. And then compassion fatigue is probably the most connected to burnout. It's deep emotional exhaustion experienced after repeat exposure to traumatic situations and stories. So basically, vicarious trauma is a precursor to compassion fatigue. So if I'm hearing day after day about really hard stories of my clients, that could kind of diminish my ability to feel empathy for them. And it's kind of called the cost of caring, right? So that's the one that's most closely related to burnout. I also want to name that some of us may be experiencing secondary trauma from the tragedies that occurred in our districts recently. So if you recognize from this discussion that you're having post-traumatic stress symptoms or other symptoms that are impacting your mental health, please consider reaching out to the Colorado Crisis Services. It's 1-844-493-TALK, or TALK is 8255. It's a 24-hour, 365-day hotline for mental health support. All right, so now we're going to talk about reversing. In the first part of my presentation, Recognize, I drew heavily on two amazing authors who are also twins to define stress and stressors, about exactly what happens when we experience stress. And they wrote the book Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. And this book has gone viral in a lot of areas, including Brene Brown's podcast, if you know her. So when we're saying that eliminating the stressor doesn't eliminate the stress you feel, that means that we have to complete the cycle. In other words, dealing with your stress is a separate response from dealing with the things that cause you stress. So we have to be intentional and let our bodies know that we're safe. And as a reminder, when we complete the stress response cycle, we are supporting our minds and bodies to help us prevent burnout. All right, so the authors identified 7 evidence-based ways to complete the stress cycle. The first and most important one is physical activity, and that's the most efficient way for your body to complete the cycle. And the authors bring up an amazing point that your body doesn't know classroom management, or it doesn't know what a contentious parent is, right? But it understands how your body is responding to the stressor. So they say that we have to speak the language of our body and counteract the stress and burnout by moving. The second one is positive social interaction. And this can be with acquaintances, friends, whoever. Just connecting and being kind to someone else can release stress. And it helps us to remember that the world is a safe and good place to be. So when you're thinking about that vicarious or secondary trauma, being around people who counteract those shifting worldviews can really support you in completing the cycle. Breathing, deep, slow breathing during the inhale for 5, hold for 5, exhale for 10. So a longer exhale. It helps us to calm down and get through the immediate heightened stress response your body might be having. So breathing is like that immediate go-to way to complete and to regulate yourself. Laughter, it leaves us feeling connected and regulated with ourselves and others. Affection with humans or pets, so being lovingly present with them, hugging someone you like, and trust and respect. Crying, so they call this the big old cry, and how that is like the ultimate physiological release of stress. Also creative expression too, whatever that means for you. So what they all have in common is that you have to do something. You can't just sit in your stress. So essentially completing the stress cycle can feel like a mindfulness exercise, because to know you have completed the cycle is to tap into your body and recognize how the energy has settled and how you're feeling calmer. All right, so the last part, resilience. How can we be resilient against burnout? We can turn our daily routines and habits into activities that help us recover from the stress of the day. The first type of recovery from burnout is internal recovery. And this is about things we can do during the course of the day to recover and support ourselves and to complete the cycle so that our stress response to unknown stressors is not as extreme. So examples of this could be setting your timer or watch to take a deep breath at the end of every hour. Another variation that I've heard is I had a professor who was a doctor, and she said that before she opened the door to a new client for their appointment, she paused and took a deep breath. So she created a habit to build in completing the cycle for herself throughout the day. Another thing to think about is, what are you doing with those spare 5 minutes after you take your class to lunch or when you have a free period? Are you overloading your brain with other stressors like emails, text messages, social media, and news? Or are you providing your body space to decompress? Maybe it's journaling or drawing for 5 minutes, listening to a favorite song, or watching something funny in order to laugh. And when you're building these positive habits, they're pretty easy to do, right? They're not difficult for us to complete, and they have a huge return on quality of life. And we want to make sure that they are rooted in those 7 ways to complete the stress cycle. There's also something called different types of rest, which I thought was really cool, and ways that we can continue our recovery after we go home. So this means basically doing something enjoyable or relaxing, whatever that means to you. It aids in recovery as long as it doesn't make you think more or stress about work. And what external recovery is about is relaxation and rest. So I remember reading these different types of rest for the first time, and it really hitting me that I am not truly resting in some of these areas. So some of these, I'm just going to read through: time away from the stressors itself, permission to not be helpful for others when we help someone else, our students, parents, families, all day, right? Doing something unproductive, connecting to art and nature, solitude to recharge, whatever that means for you, a break from the responsibilities that we hold each day, stillness to decompress, creating a safe space for ourselves, and having alone time to reconnect with ourselves. Another thing to think about is, why does this recovery work so well? It's because we detach psychologically, and that's about creating boundaries. So are you one to open your computer back up and answer emails after hours? Do you give parents your personal number and they can text you whenever? I recognize that sometimes that might be inevitable, but it's on us to create boundaries that support our daily recovery and heal us from the stress of the day so that we can complete those cycles and wake up the next day feeling more refreshed and clear. So with that in mind, depending on our role and comfort level, think about how our technology serves you or how it drains you. And one thing that I've learned to do with my work and school emails is to take off the badge on the app so that I can't see if I have new emails or texts. So I have to go into the app specifically and intentionally to retrieve them. So that allows me to not be distracted by one popping up on my phone when I'm in the middle of another task and feeling obligated to respond right away or to see what that is, right? And also think about how your identity can be so ingrained in your work that you talk about it at the dinner table or when out with friends, and that becomes who you are. So set that boundary for yourself to perhaps give a 1-minute update to others if necessary, and then leave it at that to create a sense of detachment in your brain. I know I'm going over a couple of minutes, but this is the last slide. So we all have 168 hours in a week. So much of that is taken up by things we have to do. So let's think about it. Let's run through a typical day. We wake up, we eat breakfast, hopefully, get ready for the day, drive to work, eat lunch, drive home, engage in caretaking, childcare, whatever that might be for you. Hopefully have quality time with our loved ones, maybe some exercise, hobbies, or other form of self-care, which I hope that you'll see that as a need. Eat again, you have your personal hygiene routine, you go to sleep. So if you tally up these hours for yourself and then multiply them for 7 for everything you do every day, those hours get allotted for really quickly, those 168 hours. And you'll see that. What I've seen from my clients is that they typically have 15 to 25 hours left over of free time left, where that part of that 168 is not accounted for. So my question to you is, what will you do with those hours left? Are you happy with how your hours of need are allocated? If you're especially stressed or burned out, this can be a powerful activity to do to see if you can shift some time back to yourself in order to increase your quality of life and decrease the likelihood of stress and burnout. So with that, I want you to know that taking care of yourself does not mean you first, it means you too, right? So it's not selfish, it's an act of self-preservation. That's all I got.
I'm gonna pull up some questions that you all had for Ellie. Let's see. Group 1, thank you so much for your question, which is, where to find the time to decompress? Ellie.
Yeah, so if we think back to that last section on resilience and recovery and internal and external recovery, we can think of decompression in big and small ways. So when we're in school, in the moment, at your desk, right, in the classroom, there are ways to build in like 30 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes of recovery to support yourself throughout the day, right? And those are kind of like micro recovery periods or micro breaks, right? We have to be intentional about that too. And I also recognize that we may, want to plan for that, but then a crisis occurs or there's classroom management that needs to happen, right? So I would say make the intention to do something a couple times throughout the day, right? And part of this is acceptance that it's not always going to work out the way you want to, and it's not going to be perfect. But I would say having the intention, you're halfway there, right? And as far as building out bigger times, that's where we talk about external recovery. And that happens outside of work. And that's where you need to do something that creates that psychological detachment, or in other words, not thinking about or stressing about work. So if that means watching Netflix, chilling on the couch, if that means quality time with loved ones, if that means exercise, yoga, meditation, reading a book, whatever, cooking, right? Whatever that is to you, building that in like an hour a day, right? In order to give your body the message that it can be safe and it can relax. So when we talk about decompression, it means creating space, right? Not being so tightly wound up that we bring that into the next day. So it's about finding a way each day in little and bigger ways, little and bigger chunks of time to support our recovery. So, it really does help to do that 168-hour activity where basically you first list out everything you have to and need to do throughout the week. And I named kind of like the run of the day, right? You sleep, you eat, you might have to drive to work, you have to take care of others, all those things. And then you tally those up. And if you sleep 8 hours a night times 7, that's 56 hours that's accounted for in that number, right? So then you subtract all of those from 168 and you're left with this bulk sum of hours. And that's where you can start to think about how you want to allot those hours, where you want them to go throughout your day. Maybe you do realize that you do have a spare hour a day to build in that external longer recovery time. Or if you're seeing that you're really strapped for time because of all your obligations, think about what you can shift, what time you can shift back to yourself. And if that's just not possible, because some of our work is really demanding and we just may have so many roles and responsibilities right now that that's not an option, thinking about if you just have 2 hours at the end of that 168 experiment, thinking about where you can build in 5 minutes a day, right? So 5 times 7 is 35. So that's an extra 35 minutes in your day, right? That you have to build in these little micro recovery breaks. So it's really up to us to figure out how we want to manage our time and how we want to organize our time, of the time that we have left. And that's how we can find more time.
Mm-hmm. And Ellie, you're saying that group 4 actually had a really interesting question too, of knowing all of this, what are some ways that people can start conversations about stress response?
Yeah, I really like this question. Thank you to group 4 for asking. So I think it really starts about your intention to have stress and burnout be a regular, non-stigmatized conversation that happens in school or at home, or hopefully both, right? So if we want this to be a continuing conversation, but we don't really have the rapport built with our team members or our family to talk about stress and burnout, because stress and burnout is mental health, right? And so that can be uncomfortable to talk about with people that we might not know very well, or that we haven't led them into that part of our lives. And so I think when we think about that, we need to ease into these conversations. And so if you have a grade level meeting, a team meeting, whatever that structure may be at your school, I'm not quite sure, why don't you just start by taking 5 minutes before this at the start of the meeting to check in with one another. That could just be going around the circle the first meeting and saying something that you're grateful for, saying a high and the low of the day, a peak and a pit, right? So kind of easing into getting to know one another on another level. And then eventually, I think the way to bring up stress and burnout first, and kind of how I talked about how in my school-based team, we shared our physical and emotional signs for stress. I don't recommend talking about that right away, right? That can be really uncomfortable for some people. So once you kind of build that rapport of getting to know one another on a mental health level, start with physical stress, right? Because that's a less attached way to talk about stress. So talk about what happens in our bodies when we're stressed, and just going around a circle and naming one thing. And then over time, you can talk about the emotional effects of stress, right? So I think it's not one conversation. It's building that trust within your team or your school to support each other when things are more stressful, and having conversations when you're feeling safer. So I do think it's, the beginning of the school year is a perfect time to start doing that, take 5 or take 2 at the beginning of a meeting, or, the beginning of a day with your grade level partner, whatever works, to start to build that mental health relationship, so to speak, with that person.
For more information about Project Echo and upcoming Echoes with the University of Denver, please visit mortgage.du.edu/echo or follow us on Twitter at echo_du_MCE. Thanks for watching.